1968, Filton, United Kingdom, Toulouse, France. By the late 1960s, a new kind of arms race had taken hold, not for missiles or nuclear dominance, but for prestige in the skies. In the joint factories of the British Aircraft Corporation in Filton and Aerospatiale in Toulouse, engineers worked around the clock on what they believed would redefine human travel, the Concorde. To the west, it was a marvel of cooperation and technology, proof that Europe could stand shoulder to shoulder with the aerospace might of the United States. To the Soviet Union, it was something else entirely, a target. The Concorde was no ordinary aircraft. Designed to cruise at twice the speed of sound, it required materials that could withstand heat at 2,100 kilometers per hour, engines that burned hotter than any civilian design before, and an aerodynamic profile that had to cut through the stratosphere with near surgical precision. Every element, from the aluminum alloy skin to the droop nose mechanism, was considered sensitive technology, guarded behind layers of clearance. The Anglo French partnership had invested billions of francs and pounds. What was at stake was not only speed, but the economic and symbolic superiority of Western aviation. In Moscow, these developments did not go unnoticed. Soviet intelligence assessed that whoever mastered supersonic passenger flight would control the next chapter of global mobility and scientific prestige. The Kremlin authorized the Tupolev Design Bureau to begin its own program, the Tu-144. But for all the brilliance of Soviet engineers, the USSR lagged behind in certain crucial technologies: advanced composites, computer-aided design, high-temperature turbine materials, and efficient delta-wing aerodynamics. Closing that gap through innovation alone would take years. The KGB was told to shorten the timeline. The orders went to Directorate T, responsible for scientific and industrial espionage. Reports from the Mitrokhin archive, decades later, confirmed that by 1968, Soviet operatives were already embedded in or around Western aerospace companies. Trade delegations, engineers on exchange programs, and cultural attachés all served as potential conduits. Within British intelligence files, scattered references would later surface to a figure codenamed Ace, whose identity remains disputed, but whose hand had allegedly passed tens of thousands of pages of Concorde documentation to Soviet handlers over a 2-year period. At the time, the British Aircraft Corporation operated under high secrecy, but the volume of subcontractors, hundreds of firms producing parts and components, made total security impossible. The KGB knew this. The easiest route to the blueprints was not the boardroom or the vault, but the factory floor. A drawing technician, a mid-level engineer, a courier with access to technical packets. Each represented a potential entry point. According to post-Cold War disclosures, microfilm copies of turbine layouts, intake geometries, and anti-icing systems began appearing in Soviet hands around this period. The documents alone did not hand the USSR a supersonic jet. They required interpretation and adaptation, and the Soviets' first prototypes revealed clear flaws that betrayed the independent, rushed design. But the resemblance between the two 144 and the Concorde would later be impossible to ignore. The same double delta wings, the same slender fuselage taper, even near identical air intake shapes. Western newspapers coined the term Concordsky, half mocking, half terrified that the Soviets had somehow closed a technological chasm in record time. In 1968, none of that was public. For engineers in Filton and Toulouse, the challenge was purely technical. They saw themselves as pioneers on the threshold of a new era. Yet, unknowingly, the very documents they drafted by day were being translated by night in an office thousands of kilometers away. For the KGB, each page of Concorde design data was another rung on the ladder to parity. For the West, it was the quiet beginning of an industrial breach that would take decades to fully unravel. As the year drew to a close, the first prototype stood ready for taxi tests. Britain and France celebrated what they thought was a triumph of openness and cooperation, proof that two nations could achieve what even America had failed to do. In Moscow, analysts studying the stolen technical diagrams saw something else, an opportunity to prove that Soviet science could equal Western genius. The race to Mach 2 was no longer a contest of engineers alone. It had become a duel between intelligence services. The world was entering an age where blueprints were as valuable as bombs, and espionage had become the new form of flight. 1969, Moscow, Soviet Union, Toulouse, France. By early 1969, the roar of twin ambitions could be heard on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain. In France and Britain, the Concorde prepared for its first official flight, the culmination of nearly a decade of research. In Moscow, under the dim glow of desk lamps inside the Tupolev Design Bureau, Soviet engineers pored over translated blueprints and intercepted data, fragments of another nation's brilliance, repurposed for their own. The Soviet leadership had set a clear directive: surpass the West at any cost. The Tupolev Bureau, led by the formidable Andrei Tupolev and his son Alexei, was already stretched thin designing heavy bombers and strategic reconnaissance aircraft. But this project, codenamed Article 144, carried a different kind of political urgency. It was not about warheads or deterrence. It was about prestige. The Politburo wanted to show the world that socialism could match and even overtake the capitalist West in the field of science and engineering. In theory, the Tu-144 would be the Soviet answer to Concorde, a supersonic passenger aircraft capable of cruising at Mach 2, carrying over 100 passengers and reaching any world capital in a fraction of conventional flight time. In practice, it was a reverse-engineered dream. Soviet engineers had little access to Western materials, and many of the alloys specified in the stolen Concorde data did not exist in the USSR, where the British and French used precision machining and lightweight titanium components. The Soviets substituted heavier, less heat-resistant metals. The result was an aircraft that looked like the Concorde, but behaved like a different species altogether. The resemblance was striking enough to raise suspicions abroad. Western aviation analysts noticed the shared double delta wing shape and pointed nose, both trademarks of the Concorde design. The first Tu-144 prototype rolled out at the Zhukovsky airfield outside Moscow in December 1968 bore such similarity that the press mockingly christened it Concordsky. It was an insult that carried a grain of truth. Inside the Tupolev offices, engineers worked in secrecy and under immense pressure. Each week, intelligence officers delivered new materials, sometimes schematic sketches of airframe joints, sometimes engine component diagrams. The data was inconsistent and incomplete. Much of it came from stolen fragments, couriered by hand through trade delegations or diplomatic pouches. The Soviets still had to fill in gaps through their own experimentation, leading to a series of trial and error modifications. The Soviet NK-144 engines, developed by the Kuznetsov Design Bureau, lacked the efficiency of the Concorde's Rolls-Royce Snecma Olympus 593 engines. They could achieve similar thrust, but consumed fuel at an alarming rate. The Tu-144's structure also suffered from vibration and thermal expansion issues at sustained supersonic speeds. Internal reports to the Ministry of Aviation Industry noted that the airframe behaves unpredictably under Mach 2 conditions. But such warnings were buried beneath layers of political expectation. The KGB's Directorate T continued supplying what it could. Reports from the Mitrokhin archive indicate that stolen data was microfilmed in London suburbs and passed at Cockfoster's underground station to Soviet handlers posing as trade officials. Those films contained, among other things, Concorde's landing gear schematics, cabin pressurization data, and noise reduction designs. Soviet technical translators worked day and night in a secure annex of the Ministry of Aviation to interpret them. Yet, even with these assets, the Tu-144 lagged behind. By March 1969, the Western Concorde had completed its first taxi tests. On the 2nd of March, at Toulouse, the prototype lifted off for the first time. The world's press called it a triumph of European engineering, a graceful blend of speed and control. 9 months later, on 31st December 1968, USSR calendar, the Tu-144 made its maiden flight from Zhukovsky, just weeks before Concorde's own public debut. The Soviet news agencies announced victory. Socialism had matched capitalism. In the halls of the Kremlin, applause filled the air. To the outside world, it seemed the USSR had done the impossible. But behind the celebration, engineers and security officers knew the truth. The Tu-144 could fly, yes, but it was unstable, loud, and temperamental. Its engines overheated, its fuselage strained under prolonged supersonic stress. And every problem that appeared in test flights revealed the same uncomfortable reality. Espionage could copy shapes, but not skill. The Soviets had built their shadow of Concorde, yet they could not match the West's years of iterative refinement and precision tooling. Still, the damage to secrecy was done. In Whitehall in Paris, a quiet alarm began spreading through defense and intelligence circles. 1970, London, United Kingdom, Moscow, Soviet Union. By 1970, the Cold War had entered a quieter, more insidious phase. The roar of rocket engines and the thunder of military parades were giving way to another kind of competition, one fought in laboratories, research centers, and industrial workshops. The espionage war for technology had become the new arms race, and nowhere was this more visible than in the struggle over supersonic aviation. In Britain, the Concorde program had shifted from experimentation to refinement. Engineers at the British Aircraft Corporation, BA, fine tuned the Olympus 593 engines, adjusting the fuel injection systems to reduce inefficiencies at high altitude. French technicians in Toulouse tested new heat resistant alloys, measuring every vibration, every tremor that threatened the airframe at Mach 2. To the public, Concorde represented cooperation, elegance, and progress. But within the halls of Whitehall, a different narrative was emerging, one of infiltration, theft, and quiet betrayal. The security service, MY5, had begun reviewing anomalies in the flow of technical data. Reports surfaced that detailed blueprints, once securely filed, were appearing in unexpected places. Photocopies of aerodynamic analyses, design memos, and internal reports had been requested, duplicated, and checked out under unfamiliar signatures. These traces were faint, not the work of a cinematic saboteur, but of someone who knew the bureaucratic system too well. They left no fingerprints, no forced locks, only quiet absences in the chain of custody. Across the Iron Curtain, those gaps were filled by Directorate T of the KGB, the same division tasked with acquiring Western industrial secrets. The operation had already yielded hundreds of rolls of microfilm, each carefully labeled and stored in Moscow's Technical Intelligence Archive. The most valuable among them were engine compressor designs, noise suppression schematics, and hydraulic system layouts. Soviet engineers, though often frustrated by incomplete or poorly copied data, still extracted enough insight to accelerate the Tu-144's design process. Yet the more the Soviets received, the more they revealed their dependency. The internal memos of the Ministry of Aviation, later recovered in post-Soviet archives, record arguments between military and political authorities. Some believed the Tu-144 should be a symbolic success, even if flawed, to prove ideological parity. Others feared it would expose the limitations of Soviet reverse engineering. The cracks between ambition and capability were widening. In London, suspicions deepened. MY5's Technical Counterintelligence Branch noted irregular meetings between certain employees of the BAC and representatives of the Soviet trade delegation. Officially, these delegates handled import contracts and industrial exchanges. Unofficially, many were known intelligence officers under diplomatic cover. Surveillance confirmed meetings in London cafes, hotel lobbies, and, most notably, at Cockfoster's underground station, the terminus of the Piccadilly line. It was here that a technician later identified as the suspected Agent Ace reportedly delivered microfilm packages hidden inside newspaper rolls. The transactions were brief, wordless, and repeated monthly. Agent Ace's identity remains uncertain, But according to post 1990s research by Dr. Calder Walton and references in the Metroken Archive, the spy worked at the British Aircraft Corporation between 1967 and 1970, paid modest sums by his handlers, and motivated by ideological curiosity more than profit, he transmitted technical data that later appeared in Soviet design materials. The KGB considered the operation a major technical acquisition. MI5, decades later, would label it a catastrophic breach of industrial security. But in 1970, these suspicions remained fragmentary. The Concorde program pressed forward, and public optimism masked the growing paranoia within British aerospace. Engineers were warned to restrict their conversations, blueprints were moved to locked facilities, and visitor access was curtailed. Even routine collaboration between French and British teams became mired in mistrust, each side quietly wondering how deep the infiltration had gone. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the first two 144 prototypes were undergoing high speed flight tests. Soviet engineers boasted to foreign correspondents that their jet had reached Mach 2 before Concorde, a claim technically true, but hollow in its implications. The Tu 144 could achieve speed, but not safety. Vibrations along the fuselage caused control issues at cruising altitude, and the cabin interior suffered from severe noise and temperature instability. Still, the Kremlin's propaganda machine celebrated the achievement as a triumph of socialism and Soviet ingenuity. 1971, London, United Kingdom, Moscow, Soviet Union. By 1971, the Concorde's elegant silhouette had become a symbol of Western modernity and a persistent irritant in the Soviet intelligence briefings circulating inside Lubyanka headquarters. The aircraft's success had humiliated the Kremlin's aviation establishment, whose own Tu-144 prototype, though similar in form, had revealed itself to be temperamental, inefficient, and unsafe at high altitude. For the KGB, the message was clear. Industrial theft alone was not enough. If the Soviet Union could not overtake the West in design, it would match it in knowledge through an organized permanent intelligence operation. Thus began Operation Berezina, a renewed directive from Directorate T, the branch responsible for acquiring Western scientific and technological secrets. Named after a river that had once symbolized Russia's survival through retreat, Berezina's mission was more ambitious: to penetrate the Western aerospace industry at every level, from material suppliers to test facilities. Its core objective was not just the Concorde, but the total architecture of Western aviation, flight control systems, computer assisted design methods, and production management software. The operation's priority targets were identified as the British Aircraft Corporation, BAC, Rolls-Royce, and Sud Aviation in France. Within MY5, a pattern was slowly emerging. Analysts reviewing communications traffic between the Soviet trade delegation and the Soviet embassy in London noted an unusual increase in coded transmissions referencing mechanical studies and aerodynamic data. The volume coincided with a spike in photocopy requisitions at BAC's Filton facility. Security officers noticed that technical drawing packages, once limited to team leads, were being requested by low level employees for cross checking or reproduction. These were ordinary bureaucratic irregularities until viewed together. The suspected conduit, codenamed Agent Ace, appeared again in internal correspondence. Investigators described him as a mid tier technical draftsman with intermittent access to restricted diagrams. Surveillance, limited by the constraints of diplomatic immunity, tracked his contact with two Soviet officials, both registered members of the Soviet trade delegation, later confirmed to be KGB officers. Meetings occurred at regular intervals near Cockfoster's underground station, always during off hours, often after Friday shifts. Microfilm exchanges were believed to be concealed within folded newspaper bundles or plastic document tubes. In Moscow, the operation's progress reports were met with quiet approval. The data acquired under Berezina provided critical insight into Western design philosophy, stress distribution models, fuel management algorithms, and maintenance schedules. Even partial information offered competitive advantage. The KGB's technical analysts compiled digests of the stolen material for Tupolev's engineers, highlighting innovations that could be adapted to Soviet production. In return, the intelligence officers received commendations and modest promotions. Yet the internal tone of these reports betrayed unease. Soviet engineers privately complained that much of the data lacked context. Some blueprints were outdated, others were missing crucial tolerances or specifications. The effort to fill in the blanks strained the design teams, and the two 144's reliability issues worsened. Still, the illusion of progress mattered more than precision. To the Politburo, Berezina was proof that Soviet intelligence could still compete in the technological domain where ideology had failed to inspire. Meanwhile, MY5's counterintelligence staff began tightening their net. The Security Service's D branch authorized deeper background checks on BAC employees with unusual access or foreign contacts. New clearance levels were introduced, and classified material was moved to secure vaults with traceable sign out logs. But the effort came too late. The Concorde's essential design elements, its aerodynamic model, intake geometry, and material composition, had already been compromised. Across the Atlantic, the Americans watched these developments closely. U.S. intelligence agencies had long been wary of Soviet industrial espionage, but Berezina demonstrated the scale of Moscow's ambition. The CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence issued an assessment noting that the Tu-144 shows evidence of reverse engineering consistent with the acquisition of Western design documentation. The report concluded, however, that technological imitation has not yielded operational equivalence. It was a polite way of saying that the Soviets had copied form without mastering function. 1973, Paris. Air Show, Le Bourget, France, Moscow, Soviet Union. The summer of 1973 should have been a celebration of Soviet progress. At the Paris Air Show, the world's eyes turned skyward as the long-awaited Tupolev Tu-144 took its place beside the Concorde. Two supersonic passenger jets, born from rival ideologies, stood only meters apart, twin silhouettes of ambition. To the untrained eye, they were equals, sleek, needle nosed symbols of human achievement. To the engineers who built them, they were something else entirely, a mirage of parity. The Soviet delegation arrived in Paris with unprecedented fanfare. Uniformed pilots, factory representatives, and KGB advisors presented themselves as pioneers of socialist technology. State media called it the triumph of Soviet aviation. The presence of the Concorde next to it made for irresistible Cold War theater, East and West competing not through nuclear arsenals, but through speed and spectacle. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, anxious for an international victory, ordered that the Tu-144 perform a daring public flight to demonstrate its superiority. Inside the KGB, the instruction was greeted with unease. The aircraft was not ready for such exposure. The Tu-144's record in testing had been troubling. Reports from the Zhukovsky Flight Research Institute described unstable pitch control and excessive airframe stress at high speed. The aircraft's newly modified canard wings, added to improve low-speed stability, had introduced new turbulence patterns. Soviet engineers had expressed quiet fear that public demonstration might push the machine beyond its structural limits. But the political pressure was absolute. The order came down from the Ministry of Aviation Industry. The flight would proceed, regardless of risk. On June 3rd, 1973, under a clear Parisian sky, the Tu-144 began its demonstration. It accelerated smoothly at first, engines roaring, its polished fuselage glinting in the sun. Western spectators gasped as it passed overhead, climbing rapidly before banking left, a maneuver designed to outshine Concorde's steady ascent. Seconds later, something went wrong. Eyewitnesses recalled the aircraft suddenly pitching upward, stalling, then breaking apart in midair. Two explosions followed. Fragments rained down on the village of Goussainville, killing all 6 crew and eight civilians on the ground. The scene was chaos. Firefighters rushed toward smoldering wreckage, while stunned journalists transmitted the footage worldwide. Within hours, French investigators began examining the debris, but the Soviets sealed off access to critical components, citing national security. The official Soviet explanation blamed a sudden evasive maneuver to avoid a French chase plane, a story few believed. Western analysts suspected mechanical failure brought on by excessive stress, the direct result of rushed engineering and untested modifications. For Soviet intelligence, the crash was catastrophic. Operation Berezina had promised to bridge the technological gap. Instead, it had exposed it. The KGB's internal report, later unearthed from the Mitrokhin archive, described the incident as a failure of application rather than acquisition. The data stolen from the West had been real, but the capacity to interpret and reproduce it was not. The espionage victory had produced an aircraft that could mimic the Concorde's appearance, yet lacked its discipline, refinement, and safety. Inside MOI-5, the reaction was different but equally grave. Analysts saw the disaster as proof of just how far Soviet espionage had penetrated. The uncanny similarity between the two aircraft could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. British intelligence privately concluded that at least one major breach had occurred within the bank during the late 1960s, though identifying the culprit remained elusive. The codename Agent Ace resurfaced in debriefings, but the trail had gone cold. The suspected operative had vanished from aerospace employment records by early 1970, likely exfiltrated or retired under KGB protection. In the aftermath, public narratives diverged. The Soviets framed the tragedy as an accident of overambition, a technical anomaly in an otherwise successful program. Western newspapers called it evidence of reckless imitation. Yet beneath both versions lay the same truth. Espionage had its limits. Stolen data could provide blueprints, but not mastery. The KGB could infiltrate a factory, but it could not replicate the culture of precision that made Concorde viable. Despite the crash, the Soviet Union refused to abandon its supersonic dream. Within months, the Tu-144 program resumed, now under intense secrecy. Engineers worked through nights at the Kazan plant to correct design flaws, but resources were dwindling and morale was shattered. Every fix revealed another weakness: fuel efficiency, heat stress, landing gear fatigue. 1974, Moscow, Soviet Union, Filton, United Kingdom. The wreckage of the Tu-144 at Gossenville still smoldered in the collective memory of both East and West. In Moscow, the official investigation had already been closed, blame assigned, records sealed, medals quietly awarded to the dead. Yet inside the corridors of the Ministry of Aviation Industry, the mood was not one of mourning, but of calculation. The Kremlin refused to let failure be final. The Politburo ordered the Tu-144 program to resume immediately, branding it a temporary setback in a triumph of socialist science. For the men who built it, that triumph had turned into an obligation soaked in fear. The engineers at the Tupolev Bureau were handed new blueprints derived from the stolen Concorde files, supplemented by KGB technical summaries that cross-referenced Western design data with internal Soviet research. It was a vast, chaotic archive, thousands of pages, none fully coherent, each marked adapted for domestic manufacture. The goal was no longer competition, it was preservation. The Tu-144 would fly again, not because it could succeed, but because abandoning it would mean admitting that espionage had failed. By 1974, the KGB's Directorate T was facing its own reckoning. The same operation that had once been celebrated, Berezina, was now quietly scrutinized by internal auditors. Reports circulated within Lubyanka that Agent Ace, the principal British source, had gone silent. His final contact, recorded in early 1970, had yielded incomplete materials, and subsequent efforts to reestablish communication failed. Whether he had been recalled, exposed, or simply lost in interest, Moscow never learned. The channel that had once carried Concorde's secrets had closed. Still, the damage to trust within Britain remained. At Filton, BAC officials cooperated with M15 to tighten security. New clearance levels restricted who could handle sensitive design documents. Visitors to the production line were escorted. Foreign trade officials were banned from the premises. Quietly, the security service circulated a memorandum noting that Soviet attempts at industrial penetration are continuing under scientific exchange cover. The Cold War's espionage front had shifted, but not disappeared. In the skies, the divergence between the two supersonic aircraft grew impossible to deny. Concorde was entering pre commercial trials, flying between London, Paris, and New York with confidence. The Tu 144, in contrast, was fighting physics itself. Each test flight exposed new structural weaknesses. Rivets popped under thermal expansion, engines lost thrust at cruising altitude, hydraulic leaks plagued the control systems. The engineers, exhausted and demoralized, patched one flaw only to uncover another. To the public, however, Pravda insisted that the Soviet Concorde was a marvel of innovation. The illusion persisted because it had to. Inside the KGB, the mood turned defensive. Directorate T's deputy chief circulated a confidential memorandum acknowledging over reliance on Western documentation without sufficient domestic adaptation. It was an extraordinary admission for an agency built on secrecy and pride. The report recommended a shift from outright theft to selective cooperation, scientific conferences, technical delegations, and state sponsored academic partnerships that could serve as quieter collection points. The Soviet Union, it seemed, was preparing to institutionalize espionage as research. Meanwhile, MY5's counterintelligence staff were closing their files. There would be no arrests, no public exposure of the mole. Too many years had passed, and diplomatic sensitivities were high. Britain had won the technological race, but revealing the extent of infiltration risked embarrassment. The case of the stolen Concorde secrets was officially listed as unresolved. Unofficially, within the Security Service archives, it was treated as a lesson. The enemy did not always need guns or spies in trench coats. Sometimes a photocopier was enough. For the engineers who had poured their lives into the Concorde, the revelations came quietly. A few heard whispers that their designs had reached Moscow, but most dismissed it as rumor. They continued refining what would become the first and last commercial supersonic airliner in sustained service. When the first passengers boarded test flights, they saw only luxury and speed, not the invisible war that had raged over every bolt and rivet. In Moscow, the Tu 144 finally returned to the air. It flew, briefly, reluctantly, carrying a handful of passengers on heavily monitored domestic routes between Moscow and Alma-Ata. Its flights were noisy, uncomfortable, and often delayed. Within 2 years, the program would be grounded permanently after another mid-air incident. The jet that was supposed to symbolize the triumph of Soviet intelligence had instead become its monument. 1974, Moscow, Soviet Union, Filton, United Kingdom. The wreckage of the Tu 144 at Gossenville still smoldered in the collective memory of both East and West. In Moscow, the official investigation had already been closed, blame assigned, records sealed, medals quietly awarded to the dead. Yet inside the corridors of the Ministry of Aviation Industry, the mood was not one of mourning, but of calculation. The Kremlin refused to let failure be final. The Politburo ordered the Tu-144 program to resume immediately, branding it a temporary setback in a triumph of socialist science. For the men who built it, that triumph had turned into an obligation soaked in fear. The engineers at the Tupolev Bureau were handed new blueprints derived from the stolen Concorde files, supplemented by KGB technical summaries that cross referenced Western design data with internal Soviet research. It was a vast, chaotic archive, thousands of pages, none fully coherent, each marked adapted for domestic manufacture. The goal was no longer competition, it was preservation. The Tu-144 would fly again, not because it could succeed, but because abandoning it would mean admitting that espionage had failed. By 1974, the KGB's Directorate T was facing its own reckoning. The same operation that had once been celebrated, Berezina, was now quietly scrutinized by internal auditors. Reports circulated within Lubyanka that Agent Ace, the principal British source, had gone silent. His final contact, recorded in early 1970, had yielded incomplete materials, and subsequent efforts to reestablish communication failed. Whether he had been recalled, exposed, or simply lost in interest, Moscow never learned. The channel that had once carried Concorde's secrets had closed. Still, the damage to trust within Britain remained. At Filton, BAC officials cooperated with M15 to tighten security. New clearance levels restricted who could handle sensitive design documents. Visitors to the production line were escorted. Foreign trade officials were banned from the premises. Quietly, the security service circulated a memorandum noting that Soviet attempts at industrial penetration are continuing under scientific exchange cover. The Cold War's espionage front had shifted, but not disappeared. In the skies, the divergence between the two supersonic aircraft grew impossible to deny. Concorde was entering pre-commercial trials, flying between London, Paris, and New York with confidence. The Tu-144, in contrast, was fighting physics itself. Each test flight exposed new structural weaknesses. Rivets popped under thermal expansion, engines lost thrust at cruising altitude, hydraulic leaks plagued the control systems. The engineers, exhausted and demoralized, patched one flaw only to uncover another. To the public, however, Pravda insisted that the Soviet Concorde was a marvel of innovation. The illusion persisted because it had to. Inside the KGB, the mood turned defensive. Directorate T's deputy chief circulated a confidential memorandum acknowledging over-reliance on Western documentation without sufficient domestic adaptation. It was an extraordinary admission for an agency built on secrecy and pride. The report recommended a shift from outright theft to selective cooperation, scientific conferences, technical delegations, and state-sponsored academic partnerships that could serve as quieter collection points. The Soviet Union, it seemed, was preparing to institutionalize espionage as research. Meanwhile, MI5's counterintelligence staff were closing their files. There would be no arrests, no public exposure of the mole. Too many years had passed, and diplomatic sensitivities were high. Britain had won the technological race, but revealing the extent of infiltration risked embarrassment. The case of the stolen Concorde secrets was officially listed as unresolved. Unofficially, within the Security Service archives, it was treated as a lesson. The enemy did not always need guns or spies in trench coats. Sometimes a photocopier was enough. For the engineers who had poured their lives into the Concorde, the revelations came quietly. A few heard whispers that their designs had reached Moscow, but most dismissed it as rumor. They continued refining what would become the first and last commercial supersonic airliner in sustained service. When the first passengers boarded test flights, they saw only luxury and speed, not the invisible war that had raged over every bolt and rivet. In Moscow, the Tu-144 finally returned to the air. It flew, briefly, reluctantly, carrying a handful of passengers on heavily monitored domestic routes between Moscow and Alma-Ata. Its flights were noisy, uncomfortable, and often delayed. Within 2 years, the program would be grounded permanently after another mid-air incident. The jet that was supposed to symbolize the triumph of Soviet intelligence had instead become its monument. 1983, London, United Kingdom, Moscow, Soviet Union. A decade after the Paris disaster, the world had moved on. The Concorde now sliced through the stratosphere between Europe and New York with an elegance that had once seemed impossible. Its white fuselage had become a floating monument to Western precision and patience. In Moscow, the Tu-144 sat grounded in hangars, its engines stripped, its once polished wings covered in dust. What had begun as a duel of ideas had ended in quiet humiliation. Yet beneath the surface, the story of how the Soviets had come so close and how the West had been so deeply penetrated remained hidden inside locked archives. Until, quietly, the first files began to surface. It was 1983 when British intelligence analysts revisited the Concorde leaks, this time under a broader inquiry into Cold War industrial espionage. The task force reviewed old M15 memoranda, witness lists, and unexplained document withdrawals from the late 1960s. For the first time, the case was re examined in light of new material, secret Soviet archives smuggled to the West through defectors and intercepted communications. Among them were references to Operation Berezina and to a British mole codenamed Agent Ace, described as a productive technical source within Western aerospace manufacturing. The documents revealed what investigators had long suspected. The KGB had run an extended, coordinated campaign to infiltrate the Concorde program through trade offices and cultural exchanges. More alarming were the details, the dates of meetings, the microfilm transfers, and the coded messages referencing the Swift Bird and Project Blue Thunder. It was all there, stripped of myth and speculation. MI5's counterintelligence officers, reading through the reports, realized how close Britain had come to losing not just data, but trust between its own allies. Across the Atlantic, the CIA's Office of Scientific Intelligence drew its own conclusions. An internal report titled Soviet Penetration of Western Aerospace Technology classified the Concorde theft as one of the most successful cases of industrial espionage ever executed against a Western civilian program. The irony, the report noted, was that it had failed to yield a practical Soviet advantage. The stolen information had given the USSR blueprints, but not comprehension. What the Soviets could not engineer, they mimicked. What they could not mimic, they concealed behind propaganda. In Moscow, the Tu-144's legacy was being quietly erased. Officially, the project had been suspended pending further modernization. Unofficially, it was dead. The Kazan production lines were dismantled, and the surviving aircraft were reassigned to research roles or scrapped. Engineers who had once toasted their success now avoided mentioning the name Tupolev in public. The KGB, seeking to distance itself from a failed operation, destroyed several of its Berezina progress reports. But as with so many secrets, fragments survived in the hands of those who had written them. When Vasily Mitrokhin, a KGB archivist turned defector, smuggled copies of internal intelligence records to the West in the early 1990s, British analysts finally obtained confirmation of the Concorde affair's full scope. Within those pages, the code name ACE appeared again, along with references to technical documentation totaling over 90,000 pages. The Mitrokhin archive confirmed that Soviet operatives in London had maintained monthly contact with their source until early 1970. It also confirmed that the information was transferred to Moscow through diplomatic channels, bypassing all standard security checks. In hindsight, Western analysts describe the case as the perfect espionage paradox. The Soviet Union had achieved complete access to the future and then failed to use it. The blueprints for the world's most advanced passenger jet had been stolen, replicated, and misunderstood. Espionage had achieved everything but understanding. By 1983, the Concorde's story had already entered history books as a symbol of technological optimism. The espionage beneath it remained buried beneath redacted files and bureaucratic silence. MI5's internal report recommended against public disclosure, arguing that the reputational harm of exposure would outweigh the operational benefit of admission. So the file was sealed once more under the classification Secret Industrial Penetration Case 219B. In Moscow, however, the lessons of Berezina lived on. The KGB had concluded that while technical theft could not guarantee superiority, it could guarantee survival. Even a flawed imitation could preserve the illusion of equality, and illusions were powerful currency in a world of propaganda. The Concorde operation became a blueprint of another kind, a model for all future Soviet efforts to acquire Western technology in computing, telecommunications, and energy. 1999, Cambridge, United Kingdom, Washington, D.C., United States. When the Cold War ended, its secrets did not. They waited, patiently, silently, in locked drawers and sealed envelopes, gathering dust while their custodians aged. It wasn't until the late 1990s that the first full picture of Operation Berezina emerged, drawn not from spies or pilots, but from historians. Among them was Dr. Calder Walton, a young researcher at Cambridge, who in 1999 began combing through newly declassified M15 files and excerpts from the Metrokin archive. What he found was not simply the tale of one stolen aircraft. It was a case study in how espionage could shape and ultimately distort technological progress. The documents were clinical in tone, yet charged with quiet revelation. They described in cold bureaucratic prose the anatomy of betrayal, the recruitment of a British technician inside the BAC, monthly meetings with KGB handlers under diplomatic cover, and a steady stream of microfilmed Concorde blueprints sent through the Soviet trade delegation. The reports from Moscow had even included praise from the KGB's Science and Technology Directorate, calling the case an outstanding acquisition of Western aerospace intelligence. But to historians reading them decades later, the triumph looked hollow. The deeper Dr. Walton dug, the clearer the paradox became. The Soviets had obtained near total access to Concorde's design, yet had never managed to translate those secrets into success. Each stolen schematic had been copied into the Tu-144's engineering documentation, but without the supporting context of Western tooling, materials, and aerodynamic modeling, the data was inert. The very sophistication that made Concorde revolutionary also made it incomprehensible to an industrial system built on shortcuts and coercion. In Washington, the CIA's Historical Review Program reached similar conclusions. A declassified 1998 report titled Intelligence Failures and the Limits of Industrial Espionage devoted an entire chapter to the Concorde affair. Its assessment was blunt. The Soviet Union demonstrated unparalleled capability in theft and near total incapacity in utilization. Espionage delivered blueprints, not understanding. The agency used the case as a cautionary study for the post-Cold War era, when globalized industries made such operations both easier and more meaningless. Meanwhile, the British press began revisiting the story as fragments of the Metrokin files surfaced in public. The Telegraph ran a feature headlined, "The Spy Who Stole Supersonic Flight," naming the operation for the first time and citing Walton's research. The article confirmed that over 90,000 pages of Concorde design data had been exfiltrated between 1967 and 1970, including engine performance charts and noise reduction algorithms. For a moment, the public seemed fascinated, but the fascination faded quickly. History, it turned out, moved slower than jet engines. In Moscow, the newly formed Federal Security Service, FSB, responded with denial. Former KGB officers dismissed the allegations as Western exaggerations. But among retired engineers, the truth was already an open secret. One former Tupolev designer, interviewed anonymously by a Russian journal, admitted, "We received documents, yes, but we could not use them. They were too advanced. It was like being handed a violin when you only knew how to beat a drum." The release of these files reignited an old debate within Western intelligence circles. Had the Soviets truly lost, or had they succeeded in a different way? Some analysts argued that the theft achieved its real goal, not to duplicate Concorde perfectly, but to deny the West its sense of uniqueness. By proving that nothing was beyond reach, even if only symbolically, Moscow had secured a psychological victory. Others countered that this illusion of equality had drained Soviet resources and hastened its collapse. Espionage had given the USSR the shadow of progress, not its substance. Dr. Walton's findings reached a broader audience through academic publications than television documentaries. The story captured something rare in Cold War history: a narrative without heroes, only consequences. The mole remained unnamed, the operation unresolved, the cost incalculable, but the moral was unmistakable. The race for technological dominance had not been decided in laboratories or skies. It had been fought through the fragile faith that secrets could substitute for creativity. By the turn of the millennium, both Concorde and the Soviet Union belonged to history. The aircraft still flew, but its retirement was already scheduled. The empire that tried to copy it had vanished. What remained were the archives, rows of paper, faded stamps, and the quiet realization that the greatest victories of espionage were often indistinguishable from defeats. 2003, London, United Kingdom, Zhukovsky, Russia. The last Concorde descended through gray London skies on 24th October 2003, its engines whispering the final notes of an era that had once promised to redefine the limits of human speed. Crowds gathered along the Thames, watching as the white delta-winged aircraft, once the pinnacle of European collaboration, landed for the final time. The moment was reverent, almost funereal. As its landing gear kissed the tarmac at Heathrow, the sound was more than mechanical. It was historical. The age of supersonic passenger flight had ended. Thousands of kilometers away, at the Zhukovsky airfield outside Moscow, the remains of the Soviet Tu-144 sat in disrepair. The fuselage had been stripped for parts, its aluminum skin pitted with rust, its once proud insignia fading into dull gray. The last surviving aircraft had been loaned to NASA in the 1990s for high-speed research, a poetic irony and a quiet confession that even the Soviet Union's grandest theft had ultimately served its rival's progress. The jet that had once embodied espionage's promise of parity had been reduced to a laboratory artifact, studied by the very engineers it was meant to outpace. In the 2 decades since the Cold War's end, historians and intelligence officers alike revisited Operation Berezina not as a scandal, but as a parable. The case had outlived the men who ran it, the spies who fed it, and the nations that justified it. Its consequences, however, remained etched into the architecture of modern intelligence. Britain's security service had overhauled its industrial counterintelligence framework because of it. The CIA's Science and Technology Division used it as a case study in functional failure, proof that access without understanding was strategically useless. The theft of Concorde's secrets had reshaped Western security policy more effectively than any act of sabotage. In Russia, where the archives of the old KGB were now fragmented among competing institutions, Berezina was remembered differently. Declassified memos from the 1970s, quietly released in 2002 by a minor historian, revealed that the operation's leadership had misrepresented its outcomes to the Politburo, exaggerating success to preserve funding. The two 144's failures, they wrote, were not merely engineering flaws, they were political inevitabilities born of deception. The blueprints obtained from the West had given Soviet planners the illusion of progress, but illusion could not survive physics. The report's final line, never intended for public eyes, read, "In espionage as in flight, drag increases with speed." The parallel was not lost on those who studied it. Both Concorde and the Tu-144 had flown too high, too fast, and too soon, products of ambition untempered by economic reality. One succeeded technically, but failed commercially. The other failed at both. And yet, together, they defined the technological dreams and delusions of the Cold War. The West had proven that brilliance could outlast secrecy. The East had proven that imitation could only buy time. When the last Concorde rolled into its museum hangar that autumn, curators placed it beneath soft lighting, its nose dipped forward in the posture that once sliced through supersonic winds. Visitors read plaques celebrating innovation and cooperation, but none mentioned the invisible war that had shadowed its creation, the stolen blueprints, the dead test pilots, the double agents who had exchanged engineering data for ideology. History preferred its heroes uncomplicated. At Cambridge, the researchers who had reconstructed Berezina concluded their final report. It had ended with a reflection rather than a judgment. The Cold War's espionage networks produced information faster than any scientist could study it, and faster than any system could absorb it. In that velocity lay both the triumph and the tragedy of the age. Outside, a retired Concorde stood silent under a glass dome, preserved not just as a machine, but as a monument to two competing civilizations that once believed flight could be stolen. Its engines would never ignite again, but the echoes of that competition, of betrayal, ingenuity, and blind ambition, still resonated in the steel around it. The age of supersonic flight ended where it began, not in the clouds, but in the archives, proof that knowledge can be copied, but understanding must be earned.